Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we are launching into one of the most fundamental questions humanity has ever asked.
Well,
How did we first try to define God, our purpose, our own reality?
it's a huge question.
It's a massive one. We're going on a deep dive into the earliest theological blueprints, really, from ancient Egypt and Babylonia. These are the absolute roots of organized religion, but also, and this is what's so surprising, the earliest recorded origins of atheism.
Philosophical atheism, yes. It's as old as faith itself.
Exactly. We're going to show you how Egypt's intense focus on the visible, on matter, actually forced its priests toward a very unique kind of pantheism.
While Babylon, on the other hand, got sort of stuck, their whole God as king model put a hard limit on any attempts they made at monotheism.
And we're going to unpack not just the monumental piety of these empires, but the distastering literary skepticism that was happening at the very same time. It really proves that the impulse to question faith is as ancient as faith itself.
It does.
So get ready to find the hidden DNA of your own spiritual and ethical framework, because it's buried in the sands of the Nile and the Euphrates. Okay, let's unpack this.
It is an astonishing journey, and, it immediately brings up a huge problem for us today, a methodological one.
Right.
When we try to understand those earliest beliefs, we run straight into what the sources call the modern barrier.
And that's our starting point, isn't it? The source material just hammers home how profoundly difficult it is to look back across thousands of years and really get a feel for the real character of an ancient religion.
It's almost impossible.
It's not just history. It's a deep problem of interpretation.
Mm.
And it's rooted in our own, our modern biases.
Exactly. Our minds today, they're just saturated with contemporary knowledge, with science, with very specific cultural tendencies. We understand things like, the vastness of illimitable space.
Millions of worlds, that sort of thing.
Right. And we try to overlay that understanding onto ancient beliefs. Beliefs that often centered on a tiny local Earth, sheltered under what they called an extinguisher-like firmament.
So you get a clash.
You get a huge clash. It creates what the texts call an ill-assorted mixture. You have these old, almost survivalist ideas match up with our modern scientific concepts.
So you're saying we fall into this trap of trying to make these incredibly complex belief systems that lasted for thousands of years, look rational and consistent to us now in the 21st century.
Yes. When in reality, they probably held profound internal contradictions, even for the people who lived them.
Right.
And that leads directly to this critical point. We have to distinguish between two very different groups.
Okay.
We absolutely must separate the philosophical aspirations, the abstract thought of the cultured few, the literate priests, the thinkers, from the actual day-to-day popular faith of the vast majority of people at the time.
This is a crucial distinction, because we hear these claims all the time, that ancient Egyptian religion was secretly a sublime monotheism or enlightened pantheism.
We do.
But if those beliefs were only held by, say, a handful of high priests in the temple library, that doesn't define the religion of the entire civilization, does it?
It doesn't, not at all. And confusing those two groups is where a lot of modern scholarship, I think, really missteps.
How so?
Well, the high theology of the schools, say at Heliopolis, it might have been striving towards some kind of unity, sure, but the popular faith, that was still incredibly localized, it was polytheistic, and it was focused on very practical things.
Like keeping favor with a specific god for a good harvest.
Exactly. Often an animal-headed god for very practical daily needs. We completely miss the reality of what was happening on the street if we only read the philosophical manifestos of the elite.
But what is just staggering is that even among that highly educated, literate elite, the very people who are trying to build a unified theology, we find this other tradition, this parallel, sophisticated tradition of radical disbelief.
Yes.
Skepticism isn't some modern reaction to science. It was an ancient literary genre.
Absolutely. The impulse to question the promises of faith, to question the certainty of the gods, it's as old as civilization itself. We have evidence of literary skepticism in Egypt dating back as far as the 11th dynasty.
Which is, what, around 2500 BC?
Roughly, yes.
That's incredible. That predates so much of what we typically think of as, philosophical inquiry. We're talking about texts like the famous Song of the Harper.
A powerful text.
And this wasn't just a simple question. It was a devastating, almost nihilistic challenge to the very foundation of their entire society.
To the Osirian afterlife specifically.
Exactly, to the afterlife.
The Song of the Harper is one of the most powerful ancient fragments we have. It looks at the massive tombs, it looks at the pyramids, the incredibly intricate burial preparations, all of this monumental effort.
All dedicated to the promise of resurrection.
And it just dismisses it all. It's a moment of pure existential despair, captured in poetry.
Let's focus on the emotional weight of that message.
Yeah.
The poem basically asks, what's the point of all this?
And its answer is just stark, final.
It argues that fortune and hearths and homes, they've all vanished for the dead. And the dead, they don't send back messages.
None to tell us comes.
Right, the quote is just chilling. What he does or thinks, who dies, none to tell us comes. Eat and drink in peace today. When you go, your goods remain. He who fares the last long way comes not back again.
That is the ultimate skeptical conclusion, isn't it? Mortality is absolute. Oblivion is final.
So there's no tomorrow.
Then the only rational response is to live for today. Immediate hedonism. Eat and drink in peace today. It is a complete intellectual slap in the face to the entire funerary industry of the Egyptian state.
And what's so interesting is that this tradition, it wasn't just a one-off poem. The sources mention a later satirical text, a fable.
The one with the cat and the jackal.
Right, a dialogue between an Orthodox Ethiopian cat and a jackal who's the voice of heretical unbelief. Why use a fable? And what does it tell us that the author seems to side with the jackal?
Well, the fable is a classic strategy, isn't it? It's a way to wrap dangerous or heretical ideas in a form that's a bit more palatable, a bit disguised.
Because you don't get in trouble.
Exactly. Many later philosophers did the same thing to avoid persecution, but the key insight is the author's clear sympathy for the jackal. This shows that the philosophical tradition of unbelief wasn't just being recorded and then condemned.
It was being championed.
It was being championed by intellectual figures, by people within the scribal class. It was a respected, if maybe a minority intellectual position to say that this whole complex theological structure might just be an illusion.
And we see that same hopeless, really dark skepticism pop up in other texts, like the dirge on the death of the high priest of Memphis. It just emphasizes this chilling view of the hereafter.
That dirge, it just locks down that sense of utter finality. The lines are so stark. The underworld is a land of thick darkness, a sorrowful place for the dead. They sleep after their guise, never to awaken.
Never to awaken.
That despairing view that the dead just sleep and never wake up is a complete rejection of the whole Assyrian system, which was highly structured, active, and demanding.
So it suggests that even in the heart of what we think of as the most religion-obsessed civilization ever,
there was this constant, profound human doubt, this question of whether the whole elaborate promise was anything more than just wishful thinking.
So as we transition now to look at the official, complex theological systems that the priests spent millennia building, we have to keep those skeptical voices in the back of our minds.
We do.
Because their very existence suggests that these religious systems had to work incredibly hard, and maybe sometimes fail, to justify themselves against the most basic human fear. Just annihilation.
Right. And moving from those voices of doubt to the structure of certainty, you find that Egyptian theology is a remarkable study. It's a study in how abstract philosophical thought can be, well, constrained and ultimately stopped by deeply rooted cultural ideas.
And in this case, by their intense materialism.
Specifically, yes.
Their materialism.
Okay, so let's start with the architects of that certainty. The priestly colleges. Especially the one at Heliopolis. These were the intellectual powerhouses that tried to systematize the divine, right? Taking all these chaotic local gods and imposing some kind of order.
Their first job was just categorization. Heliopolis was the source of arranging deities into the Ennead, these groups of 9.
And this was more than just making a list. Oh, much more. It was a philosophical move. By arranging the gods into a hierarchy, by connecting them through family trees or, generative relationships, it naturally led to identifying multiple gods with one another.
So if one god is just an earlier version of another god,
you're already on the path to unifying them. You're starting to see a single divine substance under different masks.
And this is how they begin to creep towards a kind of monotheistic thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
By systematizing the chaos, they start to identify a singular underlying divine thing.
Exactly. And this process eventually led to the apex of their abstract thought, the conception of the God who has no form.
Which is a remarkable intellectual leap, to acknowledge a deity that is beyond all visible, tangible limits.
It is. However, the source material notes that this abstract ideal immediately hit a wall.
A cultural wall.
A cultural wall. To confess that a god has no form is also, for the Egyptian mind, a confession of the inability to conceive of what is truly formless.
So why couldn't they sustain that idea, the concept of formlessness?
It comes back to the deeply concrete nature of the Egyptian mind. I mean, think about their world. It was born of the visible, the regular, the predictable reality of the Nile Valley.
The annual flood, the sun rising every single day, the stone for the monuments.
It's all tangible stuff. So the idea of existence without substance, pure, formless spirit, was just. It was alien to them. They couldn't really conceptualize existence apart from some kind of material container or manifestation.
And we see this limitation, don't we? When they try to define the ultimate divine essence, they use epithets like Keper Zephyr.
Which means that which is self-grown or the self-existent.
In a purely philosophical sense, that sounds like it should equate to a pure, transcendent being. The prime mover.
It should. And for a moment, it sounds like this profound transcendent philosophy. But then you look at how they applied the term, and the significance is just. It's dramatically limited.
Because they didn't just apply it to God.
No. The very same epithet, keperzos F, was applied not only to the creator god, but also to common, naturally occurring material things, plants like balsam and minerals like saltpeter.
Wait, they called saltpeter the self-existent.
They did, which tells us everything, really. It tells us that their concept of self-existence wasn't a metaphysical one, it was a material one.
So it just meant something that seemed to appear out of nowhere.
Right, something that seemed to arise spontaneously, or something that was chemically fundamental to life, like saltpeter was for mummification and preservation. They couldn't separate the physical process of seeming self-generation from the philosophical concept of pure being.
And that inability, that failure to separate the idea from the physical symbol is what kept their highest theology locked in this materialistic pantheism.
At the end of the day, yes.
Let's go back for a second to the structure they did manage to build, the Heliopolitan Ennead. How did they organize creation itself?
The ultimate origin was Nu, the primeval abyss of chaotic waters. Out of Nu comes Tum, the ancient sun god and creator. He's usually the first god we see in a full human form.
And from Tum?
From Tum, creation proceeds by generation in successive pairs. So you get Shu, who is air, and Tefnut, moisture. Then they produce Seb, the earth, and Mut, the sky.
And finally, the big mythological figures.
Finally, you get Osiris and Isis and their counterparts, Set and Niput. And this model, this creation by generation, is really interesting.
Why?
Because creating the world from pairs strongly suggests Asiatic, maybe even Babylonian, influence on their cosmology. That was a central doctrine in the Semitic kingdoms.
So this gradual, very constrained path toward unity. It eventually leads to this explosive moment of attempted reform.
The monotheistic revolution.
Led by Amenhotep IV, or as he renamed himself, Khunaten.
Khuna'ten's attempt was radical. I mean, it bordered on total heresy for the time. And it's possible the initial impulse came from Asia. His mother was a foreigner.
And he tried to completely replace the entrenched power of the Amon priesthood in Thebes with a new religion centered entirely on Aten.
The visible solar disk.
And he didn't just suggest this, he demanded it. He moved the entire capital city to Tel El Amarna just to physically escape the old religious power structures.
A huge move. And Aten's doctrine was clearly monotheistic, it was universal, and it was jealous.
It was revolutionary in its scope, wasn't it? Aten was proclaimed a god of the whole universe, not just Egypt.
All lands, all peoples, the birds in the sky, the flowers in the field. And he demanded exclusive worship. But the sources are careful to point out something crucial.
What's that?
While it was monotheistic, Aten's faith was fundamentally pantheistic.
Meaning God is everything.
Exactly. He was the living one in whom all life is contained. His divine essence was in the things he created.
You can really feel that powerful universalism in the hymn to Aten. You have lines like, he brings in the years, creates the months, makes the days, reckons the hours. He is Lord of time. It's cosmic in scale.
It is, and the conclusion is as uncompromising as anything in later faiths. Beside him, there is no other God.
It sounds like he almost got there. He almost made the leap. So we have to come back to the core question. Why did this radical, explicit monotheism fail so completely, so badly, that they tried to erase it from history right after he died?
And the failure brings us right back to that philosophical constraint we talked about, that peculiar Egyptian materialist viewpoint.
For the educated Egyptian, the divine essence, whether it was Amen or Khnum or Aden, was never fully separated from its symbol.
The divine essence was always bound to its outward garment, as the texts say.
Exactly. The divine substance was seen as having no real existence apart from its visible forms.
So for the Aten worshippers, the divine energy was literally in the solar disk itself. It was a physical thing. They couldn't make that final philosophical jump to a creator who was purely spiritual, who existed transcendentally, separate from the creation.
So it's that intense focus on sight, on the visible and concrete reality of their world, that held them back.
I think so. A civilization built on the most tangible, regular, and predictable river on Earth just struggled to imagine anything truly abstract or invisible. The Aten reform, because it lacked that philosophical transcendence, was just too radical for their deeply ingrained cultural materialism.
And the Amen priests, who understood the people's need for tangible gods, just swooped right back in and restored the old order.
They did. It was a revolution that couldn't escape its own materialist foundations.
And that same commitment to materialism, it didn't just define their gods, it defined how they understood themselves.
Absolutely. If your God has to be bound to a symbol, then your own soul has to be defined by a series of concrete, substantial parts.
And this is where Egyptian psychology gets incredibly complex. It's so far beyond our modern idea of a single, simple soul. They didn't have one soul. They had a whole kit of components.
They did, and the most important of these was the Ka.
The Ka, or the double. This is probably the hardest concept for us to really wrap our heads around.
It is. It wasn't just some ethereal ghost. It originated from a crude but very thorough philosophy where the Ka was basically the counterpart of your shadow in the visible world.
So it was considered a real, substantial thing, even though it was invisible.
A real and substantial existence, and everything had one. There was a Ka of a man, a Ka of his food, a Ka of his house, a Ka of a statue.
Okay, so if the Ka was substantial, then it follows that it had needs.
It had needs.
And that logic translates directly into the massive industry of funerary offerings.
Precisely. Since the Ka had substance, it required material sustenance, food, and drink for all eternity.
But real food rots.
And they figured that out. So the theological logic shifted. They realized that imperishable models were just as good because those models contained the Ka of the food.
And this is why they started putting highly durable things into the tombs. Cheaper terracotta cakes, or, and this is crucial, those exquisite high art statues.
Yes. So the famous statues we admire from the Old Kingdom, they weren't just portraits. They were critical, functional components of the afterlife system.
They were high-quality, substantial doubles designed to house the Ka forever and make sure the deceased survived eternally.
It gives a whole new meaning to art history, doesn't it? It was a theological necessity.
It really does.
And beyond the Ka, they detailed other components. You had the Ku, which was the luminous part, the intelligence, often imagined as a bird or a fire.
And the Ba.
And the Ba, which we usually translate as the soul, and it acted as the envelope for the Ku. The rituals were just meticulously designed to make sure no part of the individual was left behind or forgotten in the burial.
And this detailed, component-based psychology becomes incredibly influential thousands of years later.
It does, particularly through the so-called Hermetic books.
This is where Egypt really profoundly shapes Western thought.
It is. The Hermetic books provided a kind of Hellenized philosophical translation of this ancient Egyptian psychology. It made it accessible to Greek and Roman thinkers.
And what was that synthesized model?
It described the intelligence, the Ku, as being trapped in the body, its natural brightness dimmed by the flesh. Death, then, becomes this necessary release. It's a purification, allowing the intelligence to ascend into a robe of fire.
So this is the intellectual origin of the Christian concept of the struggle between the divine spirit or intelligence and the base body, the flesh.
It is a direct intellectual legacy. That Hellenized philosophy profoundly affected religious thought in Christian Alexandria. It influenced foundational theologians who then went on to shape Christian Europe.
So the psychological framework we use today, defining the soul, the intelligence, the struggle against bodily desires, it often finds its ultimate roots in the Egyptian need to make the parts of the self physically real enough to outlast the grave.
It's amazing, a materialistic origin providing the foundation for what becomes highly spiritualized abstract thought.
But the Osirian faith wasn't just about components and survival. It was about conduct. It introduced a moral dimension to salvation that was really rare in the ancient world.
This is the crucial aspect. This is what elevates Egyptian religion above so many others of its time. The Judgment Hall of Osiris made morality an integral part of religion.
It was even placed above mere ritualistic orthodoxy.
Yes. The focus shifted entirely to your ethical conduct during your life as the main prerequisite for eternity.
And the ethical demands were incredibly high, weren't they? They're detailed in the famous negative confession.
This is where the deceased has to stand before the gods and list all the sins they have not committed to prove their righteousness.
And these confessions, they go way beyond simple things like, I have not murdered or I have not stolen.
Oh, they delve deep into social and economic justice. They show a profound concern for the vulnerable in society.
For instance, the deceased had to claim, I have not exacted more work from the laborer than was just. I mean, think about that. That's a demand for fair labor practices written thousands of years ago.
It's incredible, and the concern for the marginalized is just so striking. I have not caused the slave to be ill-treated by his master, or I have made none to hunger, I have made none to weep.
They even included precise economic honesty. I have not defrauded in weighing the scales. I have not taken the milk from the mouth of the child.
This is a moral code that demands justice across every single segment of society. It's not just about adhering to religious dogma.
It implies a fierce moral order in the universe.
And the judgment scene itself illustrates this divine accounting. The heart, which was the symbol for the conscience, was weighed on a massive balance scale against the image of Mahat, or truth.
And the sources include this remarkable detail about divine mercy.
Yes, that the god Thoth, because he knew the unavoidable weakness of human nature, was said to incline the balance just slightly in the heart's favor.
So justice was absolute, but it was tempered with mercy.
Precisely. But the stakes were truly, truly eternal. The righteous soul, the one who proved their ethical worth, would complete their education in the afterlife.
And then what?
They were permitted to see God face to face and lose itself in his ineffable glory. It's a concept of complete spiritual union.
And on the other hand, the fate of the wicked was terrifying. And final.
It was. The bad soul faced a two-stage destruction. First, it was scourged, handed over to atmospheric spirits, suspended between earth and sky. Sometimes it was allowed to return temporarily
As an evil demon.
as an evil demon to drive men to murder or madness. But that was just the beginning. The ultimate punishment was to die the second death and be annihilated forever.
Complete, final non-existence.
The Egyptian system offered the highest possible spiritual reward or the most absolute extinction, all based on your ethical actions here on Earth.
So if Egypt's path to the divine was shaped by this constraint of matter and symbolism, then Babylonia offered a completely different approach.
A radically different Semitic approach. And it was shaped by hyper-anthropomorphism and a focus on kingship.
The difference is immediate, isn't it? In Babylonia, the gods were explicitly understood to be in the likeness of man. Figures like Bel-Merodach, Istar, the sun god. They're human in form, human in emotion, human in their behavior.
Completely.
So where are all the animal gods? We sort of associate ancient polytheism with a mix of human and animal forms.
But the official Babylonian pantheon had virtually no animal gods. Any of the composite forms you see, like the winged bulls that guard the palaces, or the scorpion men from mythology, they were all relegated to representing the primeval chaos.
The brood of Tiamat.
Exactly. Or they served as just humble retainers. They were completely outside the core ruling divine hierarchy.
So this sounds much more like a cosmic royal court than the sort of mysterious symbolic pantheon we saw in Egypt.
It is. The Semitic conception viewed God as a powerful ruler, a Baal. He was separate from his creation, but highly involved in its governance.
And it was intensely hierarchical and monarchical. Because the gods were modeled on powerful human kings, they behaved just like them.
They could be born, they could marry, they needed food, they needed drink.
They could even suffer and die.
Yes, as we see in the central myth of Tammuz, who was slain and taken to the underworld.
And this amplified human model of the divine led to a really unique practice, the explicit deification of Babylonian rulers during their lifetimes.
It was a very logical step for them to take. We see this with early kings like Sargon of Akkad and his grandson Naram-Sin way back around 3800 BC.
And Naram-Sin was specifically addressed as the god of Akkad.
He was. If a god is fundamentally just an extremely powerful, successful man, then the transition from mighty king to living deity is pretty seamless. It reflects a theological system that was, at its heart, practical and grounded in political power dynamics.
Okay, let's turn to the rise of Merodach, the god of Babylon. As Babylon rose to become the supreme power in the region, Merodach naturally rose with it. But his ascent didn't lead to true monotheism, did it? It's not like the attempt by Khunatan in Egypt.
No, it wasn't. Merodach received attributes and powers from older preeminent gods, most notably in Lil or Bel of Nippur. But the key distinction, and this is absolutely crucial, is that this was delegation, not absorption.
Meaning he received the power, but he didn't erase the identity of the god who gave it to him.
Exactly. Merodach was the supreme ruler, but the older gods kept their individual identities, their cult centers, and their specific rights. They served as his divine court.
So the system stayed a monarchical polytheism.
It did. It was a partnership with defined powers, but it was never a singular substance. They were peers who divided the universe among them, the sky, the earth, the waters. And Merodach was just the head of the council. He wasn't the sole reality.
So why couldn't the Babylonian priests just enforce a true monotheism? Rewrite history like later religions sometimes did.
The constraint for them was historical continuity. The sources point out that Babylonian records went back far, far beyond Babylon's political rise.
So the authority of the older cult centers like Nippur and was just too well established.
It was impossible to fully ignore or erase. Their traditions were too ancient. Even when Babylonian priests tried to artificially rewrite history, like claiming that crucial astronomical observations actually originated in Babylon, the physical evidence and the ancient authority of the older cities provided a constant counterweight.
So the history of their faith was just too long and too diverse to be forcibly unified.
It was. And you also have to consider the role of Istar.
The powerful female goddess of love and joy. She seems to have resisted being fully integrated into a strict Semitic hierarchy.
Istar is vital here. She had Sumerian origins, where gender definitions in the divine sphere were a lot more fluid.
She was sometimes seen as genderless, right?
Yes, and her worship was incredibly powerful. It demanded accommodation. The needs of her communities, including the infamous handmaids and the eunuch priests at Erech, fragmented any attempt to establish a single patriarchal supreme deity. She resisted being fully Semitized and controlled by Merodach's male-centric court.
Let's talk about the afterlife. If Egypt offered this choice between eternal bliss or total annihilation based on your ethics, what did Babylonia offer?
The Babylonian view of the afterlife was profoundly depressing. It was just grim, a dark, dreary world of dust and shadow and forgetfulness, a land of no return.
Abandon hope, all ye that enter here.
That's a very good way to put it. There was no reunion with the gods, no heavenly fields. Death meant the utter extinction of all light and all joy.
Wow. Okay, so with such a hopeless view of the afterlife, where did they place divine accounting? Where was moral judgment?
It had to be placed strictly in this world. Unlike the Egyptian, who was obsessed with the next life, the Babylonian was focused on immediate survival and prosperity here and now.
So the sun god Samas was the judge of men.
He was, and he rewarded or punished deeds immediately through worldly fortune or misfortune. If you sinned, you suffered now.
And this practical focus explains why morality wasn't really integrated into a salvific theology connected to an eternal soul.
Exactly. Morality was largely outsourced to the legislator. The sources mention an old code ascribed to the god Ea that explicitly asserts the king's responsibility for justice.
What does it say?
It says that if the king doesn't heed justice, his people perish, and the god Ea will change his destiny. If he takes bribes, then Merodach will set his foes over him.
So it's an immediate political consequence.
It is. This immediate legislative sociopolitical focus on justice meant that ethical conduct was about maintaining social order and surviving the present moment, not about securing a blissful eternity. The law enforced morality, not the promise of paradise.
So it's clear that these two great civilizations, even though they were neighbors and influenced each other, they reached vastly different theological conclusions. To summarize the Babylonian side, we see two distinct currents that contributed to their official religion.
We can trace them back to the Sumerian-Semitic divide. The Sumerian concepts, the older ones, they originated in animism or shamanism, a world that was just densely populated with spirits, terrifying demons, ghosts, and these things called lils.
And the primary focus was on sorcery, exorcism, managing fear.
It was. The Semitic concepts, on the other hand, were theistic and anthropomorphic, focusing on these powerful human-like gods.
So how did the sophisticated Semitic theology of Babylon deal with that older, fear-based Sumerian animism? Did the king gods just evolve from the ghosts?
No, and this is another crucial philosophical distinction. It was assimilation, not evolution. The theistic concepts brought by the Semites, they absorbed the older shamanism. The Sumerian animism provided this vast background of demons and spirits, and it granted niches to old practices like magic and necromancy.
But they were kept outside the main religion.
Explicitly kept outside the core state religion. They were categorized as relics of the chaos that their ruling Semitic gods had conquered.
So the famous Babylonian epic of creation, the one where Merodach conquers Tiamat, the dragon of chaos, that's a theological symbol of this victory, right?
It is the defining moment. It symbolizes the victory of organized Semitic theism, the human-like kingly gods over the primordial, chaotic, often beast-like animist world of the Sumerians.
And now we get to the legacy. Babylonia exerted this enormous yet often surprising influence on early Hebrew thought. It was a kind of literary and ritualistic blueprint that shaped Judaism and Christianity.
The parallels are foundational. You see them first in architecture and ritual. I mean, think of the Temple of Jerusalem. It incorporated multiple Babylonian concepts: the two altars, the mercy seat, the table of showbread. They all find parallels in Babylonian sanctuaries.
And what about the bronze sea in Solomon's temple? The one set on 12 oxen. That sounds incredibly specific.
It's a direct model from the Babylonian Eridu cosmology, which saw the world as floating on a primeval sweetwater ocean, the Apsu. The 12 oxen likely represent the 12 signs of the zodiac or the divisions of time. It was a fundamental piece of Babylonian cosmological architecture, repurposed for the temple.
And the twin pillars, Jachin and Boaz, the famous features of the temple gateway.
Those pillars trace their origin back to the Babylonian idea of firmly planted cosmic stakes. They're linked to the Sumerian god Ninizida, which means Lord of the Upright Post, and possibly to the god Tammuz, who was set to guard the gates of heaven. So the very structural framework of the first temple was modeled on elements that were known and used in Babylonia for millennia.
And on the literary side, the connections are even deeper.
Absolutely. The Babylonian stories of the primeval deep, the mumu or chaos, the whole structure of the cosmos. It's essentially a version of Genesis, just without that first verse, which asserts the transcendent creation by a single God. These ideas were known across the region long before the Mosaic Age.
And the Epic of Gilgamesh
Contains the incredibly detailed Babylonian deluge story with the hero Xisuthros. It is clearly the parent tradition of the account in the Hebrew scriptures.
And the story of how humanity lost immortality, that offers a crucial difference that really highlights the ultimate theological separation between the two cultures, doesn't it?
It does. The story of Adapa. In the biblical account, Adam loses immortality through disobedience by eating the forbidden fruit, asserting his own will against God's command.
But in the Babylonian myth of Adapa,
Man lost the gift of immortality due to his obedience. The god Ea told Adapa to refuse the food of life that was offered to him by Anu. The consequence is the same mortality, but the underlying moral lesson is radically different.
so despite this vast shared background of ritual and architecture and literary tradition, all these borrowings, the sources emphasize that a gulf, wide and impassable, remained between Babylonian polytheism and the uncompromising monotheism of Israel.
And that chasm is defined by a single ideological decision: how they dealt with magic and plurality.
Go on.
Babylonian polytheism, by assimilating that old Sumerian animism, it made terms with magic, with sorcery, with the old spirits of chaos. It gave them a niche outside the state religion, even if they were feared.
But the Israelite faith demanded a complete, radical break.
It systematically persecuted magic and necromancy and tolerated absolutely no other gods.
So while the Semitic background of Babylonia might have created the idea of a single supreme king god like Merodach,
It was the Hebrew rejection of that historical compromise, the rejection of animism, and the rejection of all other competing deities that ultimately forged the concept of a singular transcendent God.
it was an ideological revolution.
It created a God who was not only supreme, but whose very existence precluded the existence of any other divine or magical power, and that severed the connection to the material, decentralized polytheism of the past for good.
What a deep dive. We've traced two entirely different paths to defining the divine. We saw Egypt, constrained by its material culture, seeking unity through a kind of symbolic pantheism,
And creating these complex, substantial components for the soul, the ka, the ku.
and establishing a profoundly detailed, salvation-driven ethical system under Osiris.
And then we saw Babylonia, constrained by its own history and rooted in this idea of human-like gods choosing the path of practical polytheism.
And focusing ethical judgment entirely on this life because the next offered only shadow and forgetfulness.
And through it all, we found the earliest evidence of philosophical atheism, of despairing skepticism, proving that the human impulse to question existence is just as foundational as the impulse to build temples.
It's truly staggering that these ancient, often contradictory religious and psychological ideas still structure our modern conceptual world thousands of years later. We are still grappling with the legacies of both the Nile and the Euphrates.
Indeed, we have seen that the highly detailed, materialistic psychological concepts of ancient Egypt, the Ka, the Ku, the Ba, the morally weighed heart, they were all synthesized, simplified, and ultimately adopted by Hellenistic thought.
Which profoundly shaped the way Christian theologians define the spirit and conscience to this day, framing that struggle between the divine intelligence and the body.
Meanwhile, the Babylonian model, which insisted God was a separate, humanized entity who rewarded and punished strictly in this world, that was later rejected by the Hebrew prophets. They shifted morality to an eternal divine law and post-mortem accountability.
So, a final thought for you to consider.
Consider this. Is our own internal struggle between seeking a spiritual, abstract faith on one hand and demanding concrete material proof for our ethics on the other, that need for immediate justice versus the belief in an eternal reward, is that struggle merely the continuation of the ancient clash between the Egyptians' spiritualized matter and the Babylonians' humanized God?